please welcome Roberto and Moses.
Oh, thank you. Hopefully my audio is coming in. Hey everybody, how you doing? So Roberto, thank you for helping us with this. We're going to talk about something a little bit different, maybe than what we originally had thought about when we were looking at this cloud security thing. We were going to visually talk about infrastructure, but Microsoft has such a interesting landscape when it comes to security, and not just beyond Azure, right? Azure Active Directory specifically, that I decided that it would be it's much better served if we could look at the way that customers are deploying identity in their cloud environments and across their enterprise, in order to look at how those controls are being implemented and whether or not those controls are even being effective, right? And so that is the actual topic of conversation. It is why we're looking at identity, what are common identity or even just security anti-patterns that we are recognizing, and we put them out on our paper. We're really privileged to have Roberto from the DART team actually with us today, as he is somebody who is in the weeds, in the trenches, really just going at customer challenges, and then maybe some, instead of best practices, everybody always talks about best practices, right? So, anti-patterns in security basically are bad best practices, right? And so while we can tell you, hey, you need to have access control and you need to be able to do least privileges, right? That's what everybody's going to tell you. We thought it would be better served if we gave you some pragmatic things that you could do today in your organization as you deploy things like Azure AD or whichever IDP you choose to deploy, in order for you to immediately take advantage of some of the things that we're going to talk about today. Did I get that right, Roberto? Sounds about right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that the notion of an anti-security pattern is really people trying to do the right thing, but maybe not doing it the right way. I think everybody has the right intentions. Sometimes we see, that, older philosophy, network-centric security models, thinking and trying to apply that in the cloud environment. And sometimes that backfires on folks, or just the very real world scenarios of, compatibility with existing systems. What do I do? I really want to do multi-factor authentication, but I can't require my employees to install an app on their personal device. All of these really pragmatic controls. So I like to think about these patterns as, when bad things happen to good ideas. And we can talk, like Moses said, I'm just an incident responder. I get to, roll up my sleeves, and every day, every week, we used to talk about it when we were doing on-prem investigations of, hey, we're going to log in today into somebody's environment and see what the malware fairy brought us. Now we don't have to worry about malware. Primarily we're talking about identity-based attacks when we look at cloud environments. So, what new clever thing are people doing are these threat actors doing to exploit and figure out, where the cracks are in your defenses, where the gaps are in your foundation, right? To me, the threat actors are like water. They're going to find these little seams and they're going to figure out how to get in.
Yeah. So let's actually kind of walk through that, right? So first of all, identity is probably the one constant that everything has, right? Whether you are, maybe not DOS, right? Let's just forgive DOS for that, right? It didn't have identity, okay? But most systems have identity. And whether it's, your web app, your firewall, your VPN, your machine at this point, you hope, your phone, there's an identity attached to that. And so when you look at Microsoft in the cloud space, they're delivering infrastructure, they're delivering apps, they're also delivering just AD, right? Azure AD. I'm doing we're doing classes on cloud pen testing, and one of the questions that I constantly poll people in the class, and these are folks that are coming in from different organizations. They're not necessarily on the red team. They're just all sorts of people coming in. And one of the things that we commonly ask, or I commonly ask, is, what is your identity provider of choice, right? And there are, we give them 5 or 6 options, right? And by far, what we've seen in the last few years is that it used to be a horse race between 2 or 3 companies, and now we're seeing more and more people just saying, we just use Azure AD. And even when they were using a third-party IDP, whichever one you pick in that list, SailPoint, Okta, whichever one it is, they're federating Azure AD to that system because they're using it, they're using Office or Exchange. So Azure AD becomes this critical kind of pipeline for identity across the organization. So we figured that this would be probably the primary vector, not just for attackers, but for defenders to look at, because it's not like hanging a domain controller on the internet, but it kind of is like hanging a domain controller on the internet. And for those for the people that are uninitiated as to how cloud services work, and it doesn't matter if it's Google Cloud or if it's Azure, right? Cloud service providers typically will have resources on the right. You can see the resources that are out there, whether it's a VM, a function, a vault, etc. They'll have users or apps, and if a machine wants to talk to a file vault or a bucket, typically what will happen is the machine will have an identity, the machine will have a role. The identities and roles in Azure come from Azure AD. The identities and roles from Google. Google has their own identity system, and your users are using that same pipeline to establish their own identities, right? And so one of the things that I mentioned in the paper is, if you're going to ever see cloud native malware, it'll probably have an identity component to move around laterally, right? Because it is going to ride that channel. It'll ride this control plane channel, right? Not the data plane channel, what we're used to seeing in a typical malware scenario where things running through WMI or whatever. It'll probably be running through the portal or through the APIs to try to laterally move and to try to evade access. So this is one of those core pieces of a cloud infrastructure, is how you do identity and access management and role-based controls. So that's just a high-level view for the audience. If you've never seen a cloud environment before, if you've never worked with at least Azure before or Azure AD, this is kind of the high level of what you're looking at, right? And one of the things that's not mentioned here, we mentioned the paper, is this concept of a service account called service principals, or based on an application. So you can have, and you probably will have in your environment, service accounts that are acting on behalf of a user or are equivalent to a user and have elevated privileges. And attackers are leveraging this as well, right? And am I fair to say that, Roberto?
Absolutely.
You have the perch.
We talk about it from the perspective of, user accounts really are intended for human beings, right? And the way that you control access to those human accounts, to human being accounts, you can put things like multi-factor authentication requirements. However, if I'm really using, an application identity or a service principal identity, then those systems are not going to be able to be subject to multi-factor. One of, if you will, the anti-patterns which we see are things like user accounts which are not being used by a dedicated human. So shared mailboxes, conference room phones, things like that. They have a user account associated with them, but you can't put the same protective controls around them. Threat actors will find those, target them, and exploit them.
Yeah, and I'm sure when you say, and I'm being very cautious here about what we talk about at the times, but I'm sure when you say threat actors will use, this is because you have seen threat actors use.
100%, yes.
Okay, yeah, I just want to make sure that people in the audience realize that
It's not speculation, no.
This is not speculation. Yeah, they're working active investigations that are pretty.
Yeah.
We'll talk about them in a bit, but yeah, they're pretty. They can be pretty hairy, right? When you get down to it.
Absolutely.
Now, yeah. Now, at this point, if anybody's ever done anything with with any kind of IDP out there, I've done a lot of work with IDPs. Typically, when we get on an engagement, the first thing that people give us is a view of what's going on. We find that identity providers today, especially the newer style of applications like VPN providers that are doing software-defined perimeters, that typically they will now use IDPs as their identity source. So instead of having an internal radius, internal domain controller, etc., you try to launch your VPN provider software. It'll show up the whatever you have as an IDP. You put your username and password in, and then your VPN launches. So at this point, whether it's entry into cloud, entry into software-defined perimeters, VPNs, single sign-on, data access, email, this is the linchpin of the whole thing, right? As a matter of fact, this week there was a breach from Plex, and I had believed that my Plex account was logging in with Google. Now, just so everybody is aware, when you do a login with Google, the typical login with Google, I would say 80% of my login with Google Access was just login with Google. Nothing was being consented, no email, no applications were being requested or anything. So when the Plex breach happened, I had a high confidence level that I shouldn't worry about anything, right? However, if that system had requested access to my calendar, my email, my OneDrive, etc., then, or my Google Drive in that case, then there would be a little bit more consideration for what had occurred and what access had been defined, right? So this is the level, these are the layers of complexity that we're introducing into the mix here, right? And so identity becomes this key. Fair?
Absolutely. And honestly, we wind up asking people, things like, well, how do you authenticate, right? Are you federated? Because most organizations, they don't want their users to have, a cloud account and a desktop account. So of course they're going to federate. We want to have single sign-on. So now I have this one credential, right, to rule them all, right? So I can log into my machine. From my machine, if I've already authenticated, I want to be able to access my cloud resources with the appropriate permissions. All of those things make sense. It's about making security easy enough for a user to actually use it. But then you say, well, okay, so you're requiring multi-factor authentication when you're accessing the cloud, but what about your VPN? Oh yeah, our VPN, we haven't done multi-factor there yet. Oh, interesting, right? We'll talk about this when we get to some more of these anti-patterns here, but my personal favorite one, which I'll just go ahead and share, sorry to steal the thunder, Moses, is customers will tell us, we require, to get to the cloud, we require multi-factor authentication. And then you give them a couple of seconds and they say, unless you're coming from our corporate network. If you're coming from the corporate network, we don't want to bother the users. We just, that we don't challenge them for MFA. And
I've never seen any attacker pivot out of a corporate network. They can't do that, right?
Yeah, except for pretty much every engagement that I've worked on in the last couple of months. And which actually makes us think about, how do you protect your cloud from your corporate network? How do you protect your corporate network from your cloud? What are the transoms that data can go through, that identities go through, And like I said, these threat actors, they act like water. They will find the seams. They will find those transport mechanisms.
Yeah. So kind of what the goal here was today. So the goal for everybody here, just to level set, is there is no perfect solution. It just doesn't. I wish it existed. We would just be able to go home and, I don't know, play Minecraft.
Yep.
I don't know. But there is no perfect solution. The idea is we're going to just show you how to put up the roadblocks so that you make it infinitesimally harder for the attacker to try to accomplish their job, or to at least buy you enough time to detect what's happened. Because I think dwell time in some of these environments when it deals with identity is getting longer and longer, where as an industry, we were kind of getting shorter and shorter with the dwell time for quite a while. So kind of roadblocks will help you here, especially since a lot of these systems are just exposed. They're just on the internet, right? They're just available. And so I think, Roberto, you could probably speak to this great, right? And this is a great little idea.
Well, and everybody's seen this Venn diagram before, I'm sure, but there tends to be a mismatch, which is, as an organization, you decide, hey, these are the things I absolutely need to protect. These are my crown jewels, and, so then you start looking at it and you say, well, typically when you're investigating a security incident, it turns out that one of those things that you thought was important, that you were trying to protect, you actually weren't protecting. So, between the center circle and the lower right circle, there's going to be some overlaps, but there's going to be some gaps. And then the third one, which is, sometimes the threat actor is going after something that you didn't even know you had, or you didn't even know, would increase your risk, and you weren't even trying to protect it, but they find really valuable. So it could just be doing, things to do reconnaissance on your organization so they can plan an attack, right? What does your org chart look like? What information are we leaking out there? And what we find in most of the events that we wind up investigating are that there has been a fundamental gap between what you think you're protecting and monitoring. So, I always talk about protection and monitoring in the same sentence. If you can't see it, you can't protect it. If you can't, right? And, so we have to have visibility across all these planes. So what is it that you are monitoring? But then the next question becomes, and what is your security team looking at? You might have the signal, you might have data coming in, but if nobody's reviewing that data, are you really monitoring it, right? And then, like I said, understanding what the threat actor wants, what they're going to value, and, do we have visibility in all of those places? And when you have these mismatches, that's where you wind up, where I think I'm protecting this, I'm actually only monitoring these parts. Oh, what do you mean we don't monitor that? I thought we bought the license. Yeah, but did you deploy the license? Right? All those kinds of conversations start happening.
Yeah, fair point. So just to kind of review, right? An anti pattern. So a secure response, and secure is in a quotes here, right? To a security related problem that is kind of on the it's ineffective, right, in general, against attackers, but also can increase the attack surface. I'll give an example, right? 90-day password rotation seems great. 90 days, every 90 days, we rotate our passwords, we make them secure. In practice, what happens? The passwords get weaker and the attack surface starts to increase because people start doing patternistic passwords, right? Seasonality and dates, things like that, right? Perfect anti-pattern, right? You think you're doing something right, and over 20 years, you realize, no, this is actually terrible, right? So the idea in the paper, in this white paper that we were writing, was to highlight violations to the zero trust model, right? So if you want to have a real secure network, you want to do zero trust, at least you want to get to something that looks like zero trust. But these supposed best practices violate that model.
Yeah. The other thing you have to worry about there is you've gone to the trouble of implementing a security policy or a security control. And even if it's an ineffective one, it might give you a false sense of security. And we'll talk about a few of those as well. So it actually does the opposite. Well, I've got a good protective control over here. I understand that control. So maybe I don't have to have my security people really looking at that unless a big alarm is going off, right? And so we get that false sense of security.
Yeah, and here's my favorite one, right? Geofencing. This one comes up all the time, right? Everybody talks about, at least I know people are being trained, people are actively being trained in certain instances that, when they get certified in certain IDPs, that they have to answer questions like only allow conditions based on known IP ranges or based on geolocation, right? I imagine you've seen where attackers have just abused. Well, we already talked about corporate IPs, right? But what about geolocation? Why can't I just limit it to the US?
Well, because one thing we're seeing right now for a very sophisticated threat actor, Microsoft refers to it as Nobelium. The rest of the world thinks of it as the people behind SolarWinds, right? So we've seen this threat actor using things, basically finding an egress point within a few miles of where that actual user really egresses, right? And whether it's, a proxy service, a virtual private server, and, it looks like, it's 3 miles from that person's house. So once again, if you implement these controls, you have to understand their limitations.
Yeah, so let's talk about that for a minute, right? So if you're egressing 3 miles from somebody's home, to me, that means that 2 things are happening. Number one, the allow and block by city and state is not being fully observed by, it's basically not being blocked because it's looking like you're in the same location. But at the same time, your CASB or whatever you use for signaling isn't going to trigger those superhuman Superman rules that your identity is being logged in from 2 places on the earth, right?
Absolutely. So the idea that I can just say, I did an engagement not too long ago with a customer based in Canada, and they had put some access policies that says in order to have access to our tenant, you have to be based in Canada. So great, I fire up ExpressVPN. I'm egressing through Canada, right? Completely ineffective, security control at that point, because what's to stop a threat actor from doing that? Absolutely nothing. So it's those kinds of controls. To me, the biggest concern is that I don't want people to have a false sense of security. That things like, we cannot have a login from outside of the continental US because we blocked it. A recent case we also worked on, which was a business email compromise, or a series of business email compromises. And when we actually wound up talking to the customer, they knew, right, that, hey, well, we see these IPs. We know these IPs are threat actor IPs. We had our outsourced our outsourced operations vendor, go block those IPs. And we're like, really? Oh yeah. So we talked to the vendor. Oh yeah, we blocked them at the firewall. I'm like, for Office 365? Because we don't see you blocking any. Oh no, that was for their corporate network firewall. So just not even understanding that the cloud surface was there and that I have to control that access in a different way. Came up with a pretty interesting little mistake there for people.
My other favorite scenario anti-pattern, right, is we use MFA, right? And a lot of these are like a lot of these conditional policies, right, where we're really concerned about is you're concerned about using like when to enable MFA, like triggering MFA if I'm coming from the corporate office, triggering allowing people into a tenant based on country. But then there's these other parts of the system where it's like we have MFA, but we also have legacy protocols enabled like basic auth or IMAP or POP or things that will never support MFA, or if they support it, they do it in this really weird way.
Right.
Or we have MFA, but the MFA that we've implemented is susceptible to prompt bombing, where an attacker will sit there with your username and password. And I could see my daughter doing this, right? She was like, she was in college, and at their college they had, I believe, like a duo system, and so she got used to just saying allow, right? They just gave you the prompt and you hit allow. I could see if somebody wanted to brute force her username and password, that she would just get tired or maybe not hit the block button every time and eventually hit allow. And all it takes is one allow for the attacker to go in, right?
Yeah.
And then what we were talking today, and I don't know if you have the link for that, right? Where we're talking today with an adversary in the middle, where it just doesn't even matter.
Right.
None of this matters.
So yeah, I can find the link for it. Our colleagues in the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, a sister group to us, published a blog, I think the middle of June or July, where we've just seen an increase in what we call adversary in the middle. So basically, you think you're authenticating into Office 365. However, the threat actor has phished you. You've clicked on a link. You go to the threat actor controlled site, which looks exactly pixel by pixel, exactly like the legitimate sign-in site. You enter your username, your password. The threat actor proxies that on to Azure AD. Azure AD says, hey, you need to go satisfy multi-factor authentication. Once again, the threat actor, but it's proxied your username password. So Azure Active Directory is actually going to say, yep, I need you to satisfy multi-factor authentication. Well, that might send a text to your phone. It might call you, whatever happens, but you as the user, you entered your credentials, you're actually expecting that prompt. And as we get there, you're going to enter it. So if I enter that credential, if I enter the PIN that got sent to me over email, the threat actor is in the middle of this. They now have that, and they get the access token that comes back. Once they have that access token, they are effectively your identity, and they have satisfied multi-factor authentication. So we don't say this to discourage people from using multi-factor authentication. If multi-factor authentication is implemented properly, right, it's a great deterrent. It reduces the likelihood of just, brute force, password sprays, all those kinds of attacks by like 99.6%, I think, our last study. However, as more and more organizations start adopting multi-factor authentication, these threat actors are finding ways to defeat that as the sole security control. And these adversary in the middle, evil proxies, if you will, now we're starting to see those show up as, on the dark web as a service that you can rent. So somebody's setting up this infrastructure and I can buy some time on it. And I don't even have to set up the service. I just have to go rent time on this adversary in the middle infrastructure. And I can, go fish people. They give me the whole phishing kit, you name it. Pretty impressive.
Yeah.
There's nobody more resourceful than criminals. Okay, let's just be honest.
Right? Yeah, and we'll circle back on the prompt bombing because we'll dovetail it to some recommendations here. Yeah. So we'll give it some good time. But yeah, definitely, adversary in the middle is being really an ugly one. But for those that are asking, right, this is what a prompt bombing would look like, where you just have to hit approve. We've seen low end attackers use not low end, right? Low end is probably, but low sophistication, low OPSEC technique, right? That attackers have kind of used as a workaround to MFA because it's easy, right? The workaround, I know that Azure AD has implemented this. I think others, like I believe iCloud has implemented it, where instead of just having the basic approve, you now have something else, right? You have a prompt, a numeric MFA, if you will.
So the device you're trying to sign in from will say, I'm going to send a prompt to your application, to your mobile phone application, and you need to enter this number over here, right?
Yeah.
Over in that. So what that will protect us from is, in this case of prompt bombing, where the threat actor has somehow gotten your username and password, instead of you just getting a vanilla prompt that you can just hit approve on. And actually, then people say, well, what about the biometric? Well, yeah, I touch my thumb to approve that. But once again, that doesn't prove that I'm the one that requested the authentication. The way to prove that you're the one that requested the authentication is a piece of information is shared on a different device, which then that human being needs to transfer over to that authentication device, right? So this will defeat the prompt bombing. It does not defeat adversary in the middle.
Right. Adversary in the middle is still in play there.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So
adversaries that now have these accounts, right? Worst case scenario is you get a global admin account, or you get a contributor in Azure, and their accounts are generic, right?
Yeah.
The accounts are basically what we call overprivileged, right?
Yep. I mean, one of the things that's not as prevalent of an attack vector is if I compromise, a desktop computer or something like that, I have an opportunity to, when I'm logged in as that user, if I can access memory, maybe I can get credentials from other users, right, that have logged into that machine before. So I have this lateral movement and or elevation of privilege opportunity. In the cloud, not so much, right? Because I can't go access the process memory and go see what else is out there. However, a lot of times we are seeing that people and their identities have more privilege than they need, and they can access certain additional information. They can use that for reconnaissance, or, hey, I'm an application administrator. You know what? I could add credentials onto applications then. So there are other ways to move laterally or elevate your privilege once you get into the cloud environment. They're not the same. They're not as prevalent as what we see in, a traditional, if you will, malware-based on-premise attack. However, there are other ways to achieve many of the same objectives.
Yeah, and the big one here is not just over privileged accounts, but people using service accounts, programmatic accounts, that also are overprivileged. I mean, we know certain services have this concept of a static API key that you can compromise and then continuously use forever. But in Azure AD world, you've got the idea of an OAuth based application or a service principal that can then be used programmatically to access either data or take action on a system, right? And none of these are going to have MFA, right? And that's by design.
Well, they're
right?
they're non-humans, right?
Yeah. And what's interesting is that when an application does an action from an incident response standpoint, these applications are doing actions on behalf of the user, or let's say if they're just service principal on behalf of an application, it's going to look like Microsoft is the one attacking you or taking these actions, right? Because the application's going proxying or living through Azure AD, right? So the source IP address isn't going to be something you can key off of.
That actually depends on how the authentication is happening and which application is being used. The standard consultant answer of it depends. A lot of times we can, it looks, it's very clear that that is a threat actor who has, taken over an identity, taken over a credential associated with an application. But yeah, there are some applications which what we call confidential clients, or applications which are allowed to basically log in, store the credential securely, and the resource owner has a password credential, which then logs in the user on behalf of the application. Those are the really confusing ones, because you're right, they look like they're coming from Microsoft infrastructure.
Yeah, those are the
trickiest ones.
Yeah. Yeah.
But by and large, we do work on making sure that we can track back the authentication plane. Probably the most important security signal that we do provide, at least on the Office 365 Azure Active Directory side, are indeed these interactive sign-ins, non-interactive sign-ins, service principal sign-ins, managed service identity, sign-in telemetry. And there's as the previous speakers mentioned, in Google Cloud, in Azure Active Directory as well, we are constantly, every single authentication event is being assessed for risk. And we assign a risk score to it. And we can actually say, hey, look, I'm sorry, you as an organization can set a risk policy that says, if this is higher than medium risk, we need another factor to approve, this level of authentication, or we need you to reprove who you are, right? So there's a lot of capabilities that different organizations take advantage of. One of the things that we are seeing, though, is many times, particularly organizations that have had a very strong, traditional on-premise SOC and have a big investment in a SIEM solution there, they may not be forwarding things like these risk events into their SOC. And so there might be a bunch of trees falling in this forest and nobody's there to look at them. So just making sure, this visibility piece, right? Just because we have monitoring doesn't mean somebody's looking at it. So making sure that from an operational point of view, that your security teams know what data is available to them. And instead of just only looking at the raw data, look at the enriched data, which the platform is providing, which is telling you about risk associated with those authentications. About 9 times out of 10, when we are doing an investigation and we see the initial threat actor access into the tenant, there was a risk event associated with it. The system knew it was risky. And either, somebody did, the SOC was alerted and they made the wrong decision, which is sometimes happens, or nobody ever looked at that signal. So I think the opportunity here is, let's just make sure that you're taking advantage of all the signals that are being provided to you by the platforms.
Yep.
Sorry to be preachy.
Yeah.
I get preachy about this
fine.
stuff.
Yeah, no, that's fine. We're going to be running short on time, so I'm just going to highlight one thing here, which I thought was going to be practical, right? Microsoft does a pretty good job of actually telling the user what these things are. So here's an example of being phished, asking for consent, one of these applications that we just discussed. But it tells you right here, this is actually a known verified application. It's 365 verified. It is not a fly-by-night customer, and they actually tell you what to do. If a administrator isn't, especially a global administrator, one that can consent on behalf of your organization, isn't aware how to read this or decipher this, it can get confusing, right? You can have, you can inadvertently consent an evil organization to have full access to the calendars in your org. And now this becomes a vector, right? So even just, one of the things that we would recommend doing, I think you would recommend, is just even just disabling unverified applications, disabling unknowns. It's a control that's in there and it's seldom even enabled, right?
Right. Well, one of the things is way back when, back in the early days of the cloud, the default settings were for users to be allowed to consent to applications. Organizations really pushed back and, hey, we actually don't want users to be able to consent to applications. We would like to have a vetted set of applications. And hey, Microsoft, we would like you to use this global threat telemetry, which you have, and this global reputation data to give us an indication of this, application. How widely is it used? Does it do anything scary? Because one of the things that would happen was somebody would say, oh no, I got phished. And the SOC's response was, okay, well, did you enter your password? Yep, I entered my password. Okay, well, we're going to reset your password and then you're good. It's like, no, because resetting the password does not change the fact that I granted this application access to your email or to the entire organization's email, which would be the really scary one, on your behalf. Changing passwords will not help you. So understanding that a consent grant is different than, is granting an application a privilege to access information versus granting a user identity access to that information, right? These are different. And 5 years ago, we had a lot of problems with people not understanding the difference. I think the platforms made it stronger. And I think just in general, most organizations now understand the difference between consent phishing and general credential phishing. But it's still an important thing to understand.
Yeah, and this app, by the way, just to kind of close the loop, if somebody said accept, whoever this app is, whoever this owner is, it could be good, it could be bad, etc. This app would have full access to people's calendars, so they'd see, links to Teams meetings and things like that. Just give that some thought, because that's what the attackers are doing this, right? Mm-hmm. Now we're gonna skip war stories for a minute because we do have to wrap up, and I just want to wrap up with what can we do that is pragmatic, so instead of best practices, right? Mm-hmm. And I think some of these it sounds simple, but we find that sometimes the most obvious things is not what's being implemented. So for example, passwordless Windows Hello, I don't know if people know this, you could do MFA, but Azure AD supports WebAuthn, so people who have YubiKeys can register their YubiKeys in the account. Very simple thing, right? We still see people that do not separate their user accounts from their global admin accounts. By the way, for those that don't know, global admin account is like the domain admin, right? It would be like your day-to-day daily driver was your domain admin. We've seen, people have no concept of a privileged access device. We still see people, we're doing pen test work, and we still see people that scan the internet, find RDP exposed, and that's their Bastion host. And they're logging into their Bastion host with, usernames and passwords. MFA, right? Numeric MFA, that's just a simple one, right? Turning on numeric MFA should take no time at all. Maybe just a training exercise for your users to know what to expect. Is that about right, Roberto?
I think, this slide feels like eat your vegetables, right? So block legacy authentication, number one, okay? Because, well, number one, we're gonna do that for you starting October 1st. Anyway, so at least on big products like Exchange and SharePoint. Number two, require multi-factor authentication. Number three, to protect your cloud from your on-prem and your on-prem from your cloud, make your accounts with administrative privileges cloud only. The next thing about that is, and only use administrative accounts for administrative purposes. Don't be reading your email with a global admin account. Don't even give it a mailbox. Reduce your attack surface. These are just the basics. From a security operations point of view, know your environment and know what signals you are monitoring. If you do that, you'll probably never have to work with me, which is my number one goal, right? Because I'm an incident responder.
That's right. And
You
I
can
think
work with Moses because he's a
I'm on the red team. I'm on the red team. I'm different.
yeah.
I'll make
As I
sure that
said,
you
you can
bring it
work
to my
with Moses because
right.
he'll help you improve it, but you don't want to work with me.
No, no. If you're in a site, it's not a good thing. No.
No.
But at this point, I think thank you. I think we can close it out. Thank you, Roberto, for helping us today. I really much appreciate the work that you've done. There is a book that I think Sans, when I referred to the paper, there's a book that's going to come out in about a month or so that contains the work that we did, that has a very detailed set of instructions for this. And I think we have a Slack channel that we're going to go into and ask questions for a little while. And we'll both be in there. So if you want to join us, that'd be great. And thank you for everybody for coming over today.
Thank you so much, Roberto. Thank you so much, Moses. And those last couple of slides definitely have the next week, next month. And I'm going to just call it. I think you guys are going to win the award for best use of a Drake meme today. For that.
Yeah.
So thank you so much.